Welcome and welcome back, folks, to our third and final panel of today, Day of Remembrances, standing for redress and reclaiming history, a truly fitting conversation to conclude this first day of programming. My name is Erin Aoyama, and I am delighted to be the moderator for this panel. Over the course of the next hour or so, we will hear from four community leaders, Frank Abe, Susan Hayase, Brian Niiya, and David Inoue, about the roots and legacies of Day of Remembrance observances and the redress movement. Together, we'll reflect on some of the key historical moments of the redress movement and of redress itself, while also considering the work that remains to be done and the stories that have yet to be told. I'm so looking forward to this conversation about the meaning of community activism and the importance of knowing our histories. Before I introduce our first speaker, I just want to take a moment to, as we gather together virtually, really invite each of us to acknowledge the Native peoples whose ancestral homelands we currently occupy, and invite each of us also to learn more about the past and presence of the vibrant Native communities who make their homes here today. As we mark the significance of this day in history for Nikkei communities across North America, let us not, in doing so, cover over the backdrop of enslavement, genocide, and removal that animates American history. And so with that in mind, let me introduce our first speaker, Frank Abe. Among many other things, Frank is lead author of the graphic novel We Hereby Refuse, Japanese American Resistance to Wartime Incarceration, published in 2021, and it tells three stories of Japanese American resistance to injustice. Frank won an American Book Award for his biography of novelist John Okada and directed a PBS film, Conscience and the Constitution, on the largest organized resistance to incarceration. Frank, you are such an invaluable teacher and mentor to me, and I know to so many others, and it's really an honor to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Erin. You're so sweet to say. I first want to thank the Biden administration for the written and personal statements coming out of the White House last night. To hear Vice President Harris speak so directly about Day of Remembrance, that kind of engagement from the very top of our government was unimaginable when I think back to how it all began on a Thanksgiving weekend in 1978. Days of Remembrance have become a tradition to mark the anniversary of Executive Order 9066 on February 19th, today. And people have come to take it for granted, I think, a little bit, and assume it's always been that way. That February 19th has always been the Day of Remembrance, right? Well, what I'll show you is that this was an invented tradition, and it was invented right here in Seattle 44 years ago. I first need to set the scene a little bit. After the war, throughout the 1950s and 60s, you couldn't even call them concentration camps in public without someone trying to correct you. In letters to the editor or the then new medium of hot talk radio, the narrative around the camps was minimized by people like Lillian Baker on the left in white, founder of the One Person Americans for Historical Accuracy. Whenever the subject was raised, the response was always, remember Pearl Harbor. These weren't concentration camps. Oh no, they were relocation centers. Oh no, you were in for your own protection. A naturalized Japanese Canadian named S.I. Hayakawa leveraged his reputation for attacking student protest at San Francisco State College into a run for the U.S. Senate in 1976. And among his messages was that the incarceration of Japanese Americans, something that he never experienced himself, was the best thing for us because it helped assimilate us into American society. And sorry, David, but not to put too fine a point on it, but JCL at the time was eagerly promoting Bill Hosokawa's then new book, Nisei, The Quiet Americans, and its twin narratives of shikataganai, passive resignation in the face of injustice, and go for broke, patriotic self-sacrifice to prove that we too were Americans. It was really quite maddening, folks. In the 1970s, these were the voices that controlled the public narrative. But also by the 1970s, the Nisei were growing more secure in their careers. Their kids, like me, were grown up, getting out of college. And in Seattle, people like Shosuke Sasaki and Henry Miyatake on the left in this photo said, look, it's been 35 years. It's time for us to make a simple statement. The camps were wrong, and the government needs to apologize in some meaningful way. Most of the guys in this photo were aerospace engineers at Boeing with, as you can see, plastic pocket protectors and slide rules. Those paper flip charts were the PowerPoint of the 1970s. Henry, who was standing, laid out the moral and legal argument for redress like a flowchart for building an airplane. In particular, these flip charts laid out the so-called Seattle Plan for how Japanese Americans could fund redress themselves with the kind of income tax checkoff plan. Henry hauled these flip charts all around town to talk to members of Congress, community groups, anyone who would listen. They teamed up with San Francisco playwright Frank Chin, who was then living in Seattle, to write a long essay on Henry's grassroots redress campaign. What unexpectedly raised the profile for redress was vocal opposition from by then Senator S.I. Hayakawa, again being taken by the media as a spokesman for us. Redress was ridiculous, he said. We were projecting our feelings back for 37 years. The relocation was perfectly understandable. Even the JACL supported it at that time, he said. The Wall Street Journal joined the attack, accusing us of guilt-mongering, of snapping at compensation for ancient wrongs under the guise of human rights, and condemning a broader society in which collective guilt for past sins has become a commodity to be traded, mongered, and exploited. Well, you could feel the air leaking out of the redress balloon by this point. So Henry and Frank persuaded me to join them in organizing some kind of event to turn around public opinion and keep the issue alive. At the time, we wore it as a kind of badge of honor that Seattle JACL was called the Maverick Chapter. I think we felt, and still feel, fewer constraints of living up here in this corner of the country. So Frank Chin conceived the name, A Day of Remembrance. His first idea was that on Thanksgiving Day, all the Japanese Americans in Seattle would assemble in Pioneer Square with suitcases packed and recreate the expulsion from Seattle, with army trucks taking us back to the Western Washington Fairgrounds, the old Puyallup Assembly Center, where we'd go inside, chain ourselves to the fence, and refuse to leave. I remember Henry and Shosuke screaming at Frank, "No one wants to get arrested. No one's going to go out on Thanksgiving Day. People want to be with their families on Thanksgiving." So we changed it to the Saturday after Thanksgiving. And it would be a family event with a respectful car caravan of speakers, a recreation of a camp talent show, and a family potluck dinner. Art instructor Frank Fuji designed this poster for us that superimposes our announcement, which you can see is kind of phrased like a wedding invitation or formal invitation, over a ghost image of the original Instructions to All Persons of Japanese Ancestry poster. So this was the poster that we tacked up on telephone poles and in bowling alleys, just like the Western Defense Command posters in 1942. But many in Seattle were still uneasy with this newly emergent call for redress and reparations. So we finessed the issue while still placing the operative words in plain sight. Remember the concentration camps, stand for redress with your family. So people would know what they're getting into here. I handled the media outreach, and I was aided by another clever graphic design from Frank Fuji, this Ichi-Ni-san logo, which I'm pleased to see the Smithsonian White House now using for this event today. The bars in this kind of stylized family crest signify the first, second, and third generations of Japanese America, unified by a circle around which is twisted the barbed wire of camp. Frank Fuji would say, on the day that redress is won, the barbed wire would come off. So we got saturation media coverage by all three local TV stations, both Seattle dailies, all suburban newspapers, with this logo appearing like a trademark in each one. So, and here's an archival broadcast about our preparation for the event, courtesy of King TV in Seattle. So Kimiko, you have to tell me if you can hear the audio or not.
For Tom Takamura, a walk through the Western Washington Fairgrounds brings back the memories of a day he says will live forever in infamy. Not the bombing of Pearl Harbor, but an April day several months later, when he and 7,000 other Japanese Americans were rounded up and brought to this makeshift internment camp, built in the shadows of a roller coaster which still stands today.
Well, there was a time when a little child went to retrieve a ball and he was fired upon.
This weekend, Tom Takamura and more than 1,000 of those interned here will return to what was once known as Camp Harmony. For most, it will be their first trip back since the end of World War II. These third-generation Japanese Americans are going through their final rehearsal. They're going to recreate an old camp variety show. Some of the works of art put together during the long days of World War II will be on display this weekend. Next year, the Japanese American Association will introduce legislation in Congress to seek more than $3 billion in war reparations. $25,000 for every Japanese American imprisoned during a forgotten period of American history. There'll be a potluck at Camp Harmony and an awards ceremony, honoring the people who've done well after leaving behind a traumatic but often overlooked chapter in American history.
So that was remarkable to get that on television, all three TV stations. So we had a sense people were getting interested, but nothing prepared me for this scene here when I arrived the morning of November 25th at the parking lot of the old Seattle Pilots baseball stadium and found hundreds of cars waiting for us, close to 1,000 eager to register for the event. It felt like the entire community poured out to remember the camps and stand for redress with their families. So many showed up, we struggled to sign everyone in. It had to have been the largest single gathering of Japanese Americans in Seattle since World War II. Comedian Pat Morita came out to speak, show us support, as did the Academy Award-nominated actor Mako. We issued replicas of family number tags for people to tie to their clothing. I could be wrong, but this may have been the first such event to dramatize the expulsion using the family number tags. The energy was so electric, Seattle JSCL's Ben Nakagawa, pictured here, got the governor's office to arrange an escort of military trucks for our convoy. Led by the National Guard, the line of cars stretched down Interstate 5 as far as I could see. And inside the cars, something unexpected happened. The physical memory, just the sense memory of being forced to leave Seattle in 1942, triggered something inside the Niiya, and parents opened up to their children to share what happened to them during the war, many for the first time. Anthropologist Yasuko Takezawa has called this the event that burst open the tomb of Japanese American history, and the story went national in print and television. So what that first Day of Remembrance did was to shift the public narrative, to get the media and public opinion on our side. And the important thing is what people feared most never happened. There was no white backlash, no angry mob, no rekindling of old resentments and racism, as Hayakawa had threatened. Senator Hayakawa dismissed the Day of Remembrance as the work of overexcited sansei like me, and delighted in characterizing himself as our public enemy number one. So Frank Chin had another idea. At the follow-up Day of Remembrance in Portland, we collected $5 apiece for signatures to an open letter to Senator Hayakawa, denouncing his attacks. We placed an ad in the Pacific Citizen newspaper, and once again, the checks from Niiya poured in support of the message that you, Senator Hayakawa, were not there with us on the West Coast or in the camps. You do not speak for us. Led by Karen Saraguchi, we raised about $10,000 and more than 1,000 signatures and took out this nearly full-page ad in the Washington Post. Soon after that, Senator Inoue of Hawaii wrote the legislation for a fact-finding study commission that accomplished two immediate goals. It harnessed the energy of the popular support that we generated, and two, it served to neutralize the opposition of Hayakawa, his fellow senator, by getting him to co-sign it. So we've come quite a distance from 1978 in that day. It was planned as a one-time event. But again, seeing the statement last night from President Biden and hearing the words of Vice President Harris, I'm astonished at how the idea, how far it's come, how it's continued to be observed year after year to this day. But while a Day of Remembrance is often observed as a commemoration or a time for reflection, it was founded in the heat of political pushback. It was always about taking action. And over the last 44 years, I've been pleased to see communities use the Day of Remembrance as a rallying point to stand with other targeted groups, as we're seeing across the country this very day. I'll have more to say about the legacy later, but first we'll hear from our other speakers. Thank you, Erin.
Thank you so much, Frank. That was incredibly moving to see those images and that coverage. Oh my goodness. But also such an important reminder of the roots of these days of remembrances and the work that we are still doing, continuing to do. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm so looking forward to talking with you during the Q&A. Next, I'm delighted to introduce Susan Hayase, our next speaker. Susan, a longtime activist in the San Jose Japanese American community, was part of the grassroots movement for redress and reparations, working with the Nihomachi Outreach Committee and NCRR, Nikkei for Civil Rights and Redress. He performed with San Jose Taiko in the 1980s and served on the Civil Liberties Public Education Fund board. Susan is one of the co-founders of San Jose Nikkei Resistors, a multi-generational grassroots organization dedicated to defending civil liberties and social justice for all. Susan, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very honored to be here. I'll just say that in 1998, I was also honored to be on the Civil Liberties Public Education Fund board, which came out of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, and we had the first National Day of Remembrance in 1998. So it's great to be part of this event today. I echo what Frank is saying about the political nature of Day of Remembrance. As he mentioned, the Day of Remembrance is now a community institution, and it's easy to see its very moving and symbolic power. But for San Jose, the hidden history of the San Jose Day of Remembrance is that it was an invention and a tool of grassroots organizing for political purpose. And I want to really focus on San Jose because although there are many broad generalizations we can say about the Day of Remembrance over the years and in different places, I think the origins are in the local areas, and each DOR still retains their local character. Let's see. So how did the San Jose Day of Remembrance come about? Several developments set the stage in San Jose in 1979. Shortly after the Seattle Day of Remembrance, the previous November, on February 19th, 1979, Tanforan Day of Remembrance was organized, and it also included a car caravan. It included a caravan from all the communities that had been forced out of their homes into the Tanforan temporary concentration camp. Also in 1979, the Tule Lake Pilgrimage, which was organized by many different individuals and groups in the San Francisco Bay Area, was raising the discussion on redress and reparations. And this kind of a pilgrimage brought community people and college students and many young people like myself into the discussion. I attended the 1979 Tule Lake Pilgrimage, and it was transformative. So there was a growing social movement and a growing conversation around the camps. Also in 1979, in San Jose, the Nihomachi Outreach Committee formed. It initially formed out of a concern for redevelopment, but ultimately turns its focus to redress and reparations, and not joined as a founding organization of the National Coalition for Redress and Reparations in 1980. So both the Tule Lake Pilgrimage and the Day of Remembrance both provided a forum that had not actually previously existed anywhere to collectively remember and discuss and unite around our history and our future. So what were the early days of remembrance like? In San Jose, 1981 was the first San Jose Day of Remembrance. This was an event that we felt must meet the needs of the grassroots. And the purpose was to build a united front for redress and reparations. This meant everybody was included. This meant workers, business owners, residents, as well as dispersed community members. It meant all generations, all churches, Japanese American organizations, elected officials, and cultural workers, meaning artists and musicians. I think that looking back on those days, it was natural that people could really identify with the importance of remembering. And I think all of us felt like it was an honor to be part of that process. In San Jose, we, and in many days of remembrance, I know that there are candle lighting rituals. In San Jose, we did a candlelight procession through the streets of San Jose, Japantown. And it wasn't a march. And I think I want to emphasize that it was a procession because it was very solemn. It was very symbolic in and of itself. We had 2 banners, and we took off in 2 processions which diverged and walked down separate blocks in San Jose, Japantown, and then turned and reunited to re-enter the venue together. And there was a moving and atmospheric backdrop by San Jose Taiko. This was a public action, very similar to what Frank was describing in Seattle. And this was very unusual for Japanese Americans. It was taking a public stand. This was in direct opposition to the pressures of the model minority that had been pushed on us. Many people were surprised. But also another important part of this first Day of Remembrance in 1981 was to prepare the community for the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, the CWRIC commission. So we had to find people to testify and to drive towards some kind of repair. So in addition to the remembrance at the DORs, we talked about the principles of unity of the NCRR. We felt that it made sense to talk about not only our memories of the camps, but about apology, about reparations, about community education, about overturning the legal basis for the camps, and about community restitution. And people were open to it because of the whole context of remembering and with their families and their community. Another really important aspect of the Day of Remembrance in San Jose was the really central role that Japanese American art and culture played. We were so lucky for the contributions of local artists and musicians who were a part of the community and who played a really crucial role to inspire people to become part of what was happening and to really shake off the identity that had been imposed on us during World War II. So San Jose Taiko is shown here, and I just want to note for insiders who can look in the back of that picture, that mobile service station is now Roy's Station Cafe. Also, I wanted to note that John Jang and Francis Wong were activists in the community, and they played really important roles in terms of composing and performing very incredible music to express the feelings of what was going on in the redress movement. John Jang and the Pan Asian Orchestra and John's composition Reparations Now, to me, was kind of a soundtrack to the redress movement. Francis Wong also composed a piece specifically for Day of Remembrance. Another aspect of early Day of Remembrance was to mobilize the Issei. We felt that it was so important to get the Japanese-speaking testimony into the commission hearings. The Issei in particular had been squelched by the US government in the camps, and they had not had a chance to speak and to really have their day in court. This is Mrs. Umeno Fujino, and I want to note her contribution. In particular, she was an important figure in San Jose, Japantown. She was the owner of the Mandarin restaurant. And while at first she was very hesitant to participate, I think the idea of kodomo no tame ni, for the sake of the children, made her decide that she was going to participate. And as a result of her leadership, 4 other Issei from San Jose testified. We were so proud of the San Jose Issei who just were incredible testifying. And I want to also note that this was an effort of the entire community. With the support of Asian Law Alliance and the UIKAI Senior Center, we were able to have translations for the seniors and for all of our programs. It was also really important to get the involvement of the Nisei. The Nisei were critical in the redress movement. We met some Nisei through house meetings. Somebody would host and invite their family and friends. And I remember we'd show our NCRR slideshow, and then we'd ask the people there what had happened to them and their family. And it was dramatic and it was heartbreaking, and we all cried. But I think what happened in those house meetings, that it really cemented a bond between the Nisei and the Sansei activists. And the 3 people I'm showing here are 3 people I wanted to highlight from San Jose. Sue Tokushige was a retired nurse. She was a spokesperson. She was a moral force, and her dramatic CWRIC testimony has been retold in multiple dramatic and art pieces. Mitsuko Shiyama was one of the 63 Heart Mountain draft resistors who played a key role in fighting for a JCL apology to the resistors, which was a key moment in community reconciliation. And Art Shibayama was a leader in the ongoing struggle for Japanese Latin American redress, which is unfortunately still ongoing. But I wanted to highlight them because they were active members in our Nihomachi Outreach Committee, community organization, and their contributions are incalculable. We were so honored to work with them, and they shaped the work of NOC and the NCRR in San Jose. But because the first DOR was only the beginning, there were the hearings, there were many other things that we had to do. There were more Tule Lake pilgrimages. That brought more former incarcerees and their families into the movement, and inspired multiple generations of college students to join. There were camp art shows. Much of the art was found in boxes in people's garages. And there were programs and discussion groups and press conferences. We had letter writing campaigns and mochi pounding. And for the NCRR organizations like NOC, we also participated in broader community and supported organizations like in San Jose, like Rasa C, which was an immigrant rights organization. We also supported the call for justice for the family of Melvin Truss, a 17-year-old Black high school student who was executed by a San Jose police officer. And we participated in the Rainbow Coalition and the Jesse Jackson presidential primary campaign. So we felt very strongly that the redress and reparations campaign of Japanese Americans was a part of all of the movements for justice and equality. And even before 9/11 and the necessity to support Arab Americans and Muslim Americans, all of these issues were a traditional part of Day of Remembrance in San Jose. And I just want to end with the idea that the work is continuing. There are many, many things that Japanese Americans have been uniting on to work for the repair and restorative justice for African Americans. And we have been doing immigrant rights work and also trying to protect our communities. So I want to encourage everybody who enjoys the Day of Remembrance programs in your own communities to join with organizations and join with all of us and work on justice and equality going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Susan. I'm really looking forward to asking you a little bit more about the work that you're continuing to do today, and thanks for that little preview. Next, I'm thrilled to introduce Brian Niiya, who some of you may recognize from last night's opening program. Brian, a public historian, is the content director for Densho and editor of the Densho Encyclopedia. Originally from Los Angeles, Brian formerly served as a curator and administrator for both the Japanese American National Museum and the Japanese Cultural Center of Hawaii. So Brian, thank you so much for being here to share some of your knowledge with us.
Thanks, Erin, and thanks all the other panelists. It was great hearing from Frank and Susan about those early DORs. And what I thought I'd do in this brief time is just talk a little bit about the evolution of the Days of Remembrance, kind of wearing my historian's hat, and then identify kind of some common themes or purposes of them over time, and then maybe think about where they may be going. I think as Frank and Susan have noted, it's so clear that the origins of the Days of Remembrance are really part and parcel of the redress movement. And looking back at the first decade or so, I was surprised at how focused, really narrowly focused it was on redress. And it was redress movement defined widely, right? Also including the Coram Nobis cases and what is now largely forgotten, the lawsuit filed by the NCJAR, National Council for Japanese American Redress, led by William Horry. So those were all part of these Days of Remembrance in the 1980s. A couple of quick observations is I was struck by how quickly, and Frank alluded to this, the Day of Remembrance went from this beginning in 1978 to becoming like tradition, something we always do within just a couple of years, right? They were annual events that were done in all the major cities where there were large Japanese American populations by the early 80s. And if you were joining in the mid 80s, you'd have sworn that these had been going on for years when they had actually been invented just a little bit before that. And the second thing that Frank also alluded to is the power of place, that many of these were held at the sites of the so-called assembly centers, not just Tanforan and Puyallup, but also in Portland. You know, for years, Salinas has held it theirs at the site of the former camp there, and others as well. In terms of the purpose that they served in the context of the redress movement, remember that the first ones were starting before the commission hearings, right? We often think of commission hearings as that catharsis, that moment when Japanese Americans spoke out about their incarceration for the very first time and normalized speaking out. But DORs had them beat by 3 years, right? And I think it served a similar function. There was a power in seeing a Nisei talk about their experience in camp before hundreds or thousands of people and inspiring others to talk about it, kind of normalizing that experience. And DORs played a big part in that process. I think they also, and they certainly served kind of a rallying function of building support for the redress movement. They strengthened those numbers and seeing all those people coming out. But it's hard to imagine in the current age, but before the internet and before social media, there also seemed to be kind of this town crier or news function that goes along with them, because it's people who are involved in the redress movement, it's political leaders, it's providing updates on where the legislation is. It's, you need to write letters to support, this particular bill or that particular bill. After the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 passed, it was information on how one might apply for redress, the status of the various categories of cases that were denied or whether they had been reinstated. So there's kind of this news element also, which you don't really see anymore, right? Because of the internet and all. But DORs were just such a critical part of the redress movement and dominated those first decades. But then in the 90s, after redress, although there was still a continuation of coverage of redress even into the 90s, you started to see a little bit of a switch where many of the DORs started to focus on drawing parallels between what happened to Japanese Americans in 1942 versus things that were going on in the present, attacks on civil liberties, attacks on, racism and attacks on religion and so forth. After the Gulf War, there were DORs that focused on attacks on Arab and Muslim Americans. In the 90s, there was this issue of Japan bashing and anti-immigrant sentiment that seeps into many of the DORs. But in particular, after 9/11, the focusing on the parallels between what was happening with the Patriot Act and the imprisonment and harassment of Arab and Muslim Americans and those perceived as Arab or Muslim became a dominant theme in DORs in the years after 9/11. Just to pick one at random, in 2003, a candlelight vigil in San Francisco, Dale Minami spoke and he asked, what happened to Japanese Americans is happening to Arab Americans and Muslim Americans today. The denial of constitutional rights and the repression, the war on dissent, it's being replicated. In Honolulu, I was involved with DORs there, and we worked with the local Muslim community in Honolulu. I remember Chris Iijima giving this impassioned speech. The filmmaker Cynthia Gates Fujikawa actually filmed DORs across the country, including Honolulu, New York, Seattle, San Francisco, and LA, recognizing the historic nature of that moment in time. And I feel like that's kind of continued, right? I think that's become the dominant theme of Days of Remembrance subsequently up to the present. The issues may be different, but it's a focus on what we as Japanese Americans can do, that because of our wartime experience, this gives us a platform from which we can speak out when we see others who are attacked in the same way that we were in 1942. And we see this as our duty now. And I think this has been a dominant focus of DORs, whether it's on, the Patriot Act, on immigration restrictions, on the Muslim ban, on supporting reparations for African Americans, or whatever. This has been a dominant theme of DORs subsequently. Kind of running parallel to that, other Days of Remembrance have also focused on highlighting new books, new films, new plays, exhibitions, often local things that are going on in local communities that get kind of a bigger stage by being tied to DORs. So just some examples, Lani Ding's classic Nisei Soldier Standard Bearer for an Exiled People film premiered at Days of Remembrance in San Francisco and New York in 1984. There are many other examples of this. When in Honolulu, we've highlighted efforts to preserve, acquire, document the Honolulu site in Days of Remembrance in the late aughts. Just last year, I remember watching a virtual Day of Remembrance that highlights the new Marysville Memorial at the site of the former detention site there. So that's another key thing that you see in many Days of Remembrance in recent decades. And you especially have seen it after 2000, when you've seen this proliferation of projects that have come forward, thanks in large part to civil liberties, public funding, both national and at the state level in Washington and California, and more recently, the Japanese American Confinement Sites grant projects. And Days of Remembrance are a way to highlight a lot of those projects at the local level to a larger national audience. Many DORs also are backward looking and still highlight the experiences of things that happened during World War II and also during the Redress movement. But just, I don't want to go on too long. There's a lot of other things to note, but I think some of the things that have changed over time is that, I was looking at the JCL website the other day, and I counted 47 Day of Remembrance events, virtual ones that are taking place this week, and they missed a few too. So it's undoubtedly over 50. So I think if you had asked someone in 1980 about the future of DORs, it would be hard to imagine that there would be so many more now than there were back then. Many of them now are on college campuses. I was just part of one at the University of Puget Sound with this wonderfully engaged student body. So it's great to see that, and great to see this further evolution of the DORs. Clearly, they're going to go on for many years. It'll be fascinating to see what happens from here. There's clearly kind of this connection with pilgrimages, which are enjoying kind of a similar kind of growth. And yeah, I'll stop here, but it'll be fascinating to see that continued evolution and where we go from here as in the years to come.
Thank you so much, Brian. I learned something or many things new from you every time I see you, so today was certainly no exception. Finally, I'm so pleased to introduce David Inoue, our final speaker. David was appointed Executive Director for the for the Japanese American Citizens League in July of 2017. Before his appointment, he served 10 years as the Administrative Director at a medical shelter for homeless men. He also specialized in healthcare policy with the National Association of Public Hospitals and Health Systems and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. David, thank you so much for all of your work with JACL National to put this programming weekend together, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Erin, for all the work you're doing today and tomorrow moderating all these sessions. I can't imagine what it's been like for you for these several hours. It's I don't know if it's unfortunate that I have to follow Frank, Susan, and Brian, but I'm going to try and build a little bit upon what they've said and hopefully not be too repetitive of some of what they've already put forward. I wanted to start off by just kind of considering what the title of this session is, particularly that part about reclaiming history. Because if we have really learned anything, is that regardless of what we want to happen, that history does repeat itself. And what happened with Japanese Americans did not happen in any sort of a vacuum. It wasn't in isolation. It wasn't like all of a sudden people said, oh, we need to protect ourselves from the Japanese. It had been there for years. And that same xenophobia that went back to the Chinese Exclusion Act of the late 1800s is that same xenophobia that led to our incarceration. I think one thing when we talk about Days of Remembrance, one thing that's notable about this year's sort of national DOR commemoration that we're doing here is that this actually evolved from what are typically local events. For the last 15 years or so, this program has been one where the Smithsonian has collaborated with our local Washington, D.C. chapter, along with the Japanese American Veterans Association, the National Japanese American Memorial Foundation, national organizations in themselves, but still the program was something that was done locally. And as Brian had mentioned on the JCL website, I think we actually have 48 listed now, but I know that we are missing others. So there are clearly over 50 events going on in these probably 2 weeks or so of time across the country. But the reality is that these are all being done virtually. So the reality is that there are several national DOR events going on, and I would encourage people to check out many of those others that are happening. It actually does kind of ping me this year because even as we're here on this panel, the Los Angeles Community DOR is actually happening at this exact same time. And that is typically one of the largest events. It's led by a large coalition of Japanese American organizations there in the Los Angeles area and is typically done in person, housed at JANM, the Japanese American National Museum. So it's really unfortunate that we have this scheduling issue, but I think when we have as many programs that are going on, it's a nice abundance of wealth that people are able to tune into various programs and learn different aspects. And that's what I'd like to talk about a little bit here. I really, DOR really is one of the major things that JCL chapters do and that members of the Japanese American community really focus on as part of our education focus to educate people about the Japanese American experience, but also it's an opportunity to collaborate with other communities, which becomes quite apparent as you do look through a lot of these events that are going on. But it's a way for us to connect our experience to the injustices that other communities experience. As I noted earlier, our Japanese American history is also a part of the history of the broader Asian American community. One that really didn't exist until relatively recently, and within the last probably 50 or 60 so years, that there was no real Asian American community. But it's one that we see particularly now as we talk about anti-Asian hate, particularly that targeting Chinese and Chinese Americans because of COVID, and also the animosity directed towards China that we're seeing even in policies and potential legislation sometimes. I think one of the things that we have is the lesson of Vincent Chin that people do not distinguish between Chinese or Japanese. So targeting one group does target us all. And it's vital that we all do stand up together and not be separated. I think back to some of those signs during World War II of other Asians, largely Chinese, who would say, I am not Japanese, because they didn't want to be targeted for the same racism that was being directed towards Japanese. But I think now we recognize that if there is racism being directed towards one group, that same racism is probably being directed in the direction of another one of us as well. As Brian had mentioned earlier, September 11th was really a watershed event. It was the first time that there was an attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor. But the rallying cry of Japanese Americans in support of the Muslim community was immediate in force. For JACL, we had John Tateishi was our national director, Floyd Mori was our national president, and we had Christine Minami here in Washington, D.C. as the representative. But they really brought together the Japanese American community initially. And it was actually right after the National Memorial had opened here in Washington, D.C. So that actually served as the focal point for a lot of the activity. But I think that as we demonstrated our solidarity with the Muslim community, that really has become one of the focal points for a lot of the DOR events. And that was really reinforced under the Trump administration with the Muslim ban as well. To give a little bit of sort of the historic and also the policy parallels between those, I did want to just sort of talk about how does Executive Order 9066 really parallel some of the actions against Muslims, particularly that Muslim travel ban. And that if you look at EO 9066, it actually does not mention anything about Japanese American. It talks about giving the military the authority to act and to remove people and to incarcerate them as it saw necessary for military necessity. Similarly, you look at the Muslim travel ban. It doesn't say anything about Muslims. It talks about countries that it's going to target. You look at those countries and you quickly realize that those are largely Muslim majority nations. And then you put it into the context of the clear racial animus that the president had directed towards Muslims, and it's pretty clear what the purpose of that executive order was. I think the other thing that when we look at the Supreme Court and how it addressed both cases, that the Supreme Court, when it looked at Executive Order 9066, it did not address whether the security threat that was claimed was legitimate or not. And similarly, when the Roberts Supreme Court looked at the Muslim travel ban, it similarly looked the other way and said it's not our right to judge whether there exists a true security threat. And what's frightening about that is it really does place the power with the executive branch to take these types of actions without any sort of oversight or checks or balances. So that brings me to one of the things that Susan had raised earlier is that part of the point of Days of Remembrance is to combat some of the legal underpinnings of how Japanese American incarceration happened. And I wanted to highlight that right now there is legislation to do just that. It is to repeal the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. And yes, you heard me right, that it's legislation from 1798, part of the Alien and Sedition Acts, which you probably learned about in high school history. But these remain on our books, and it gives essentially the president the power to do exactly what was done to Japanese Americans or what was done in the Muslim travel ban to exclude, to discriminate against people because they are deemed a security threat. So the legislation has been introduced by Representative Omar in the House, and on the Senate side, Senator Hirono actually just introduced the companion bill this week in recognition of the fact that this is Day of Remembrance this weekend. Sort of building upon that, we also have seen the issues around immigration, the application of the lessons from 9066 and our Japanese American history. I think you saw the Japanese American community really speak out when we saw the policy of family detention and separation that was happening in the previous administration. It really struck a nerve for many Japanese Americans as they saw immigrant families being placed in the same types of barrack-like detention facilities that eerily resembled the American concentration camps of World War II. And then along came COVID. And with that, the opportunity for the government to once again apply policy to, or apply a legal basis to the policies that it was actually enacting. Under Title 42, the Public Health Act, we began to both exclude, but also to begin actually actively deporting people under this sort of supposed threat of COVID-19 and the public health threat that it imposed upon our country. I think in reality, we recognize that the actual public health threat probably is coming more from some people within our own borders, that our own citizens, than some of these immigrants that were actually being targeted falsely for their supposed threat to our public's health. And what you see now, and President Biden has said that he wants to let the science lead us in the COVID-19 pandemic. But the reality is that most public health experts have actually come out and said that there is no health threats. So another case of policy being used against people inappropriately. And finally, when we talk about history, I wanted to go back to history that goes long before the injustice against Japanese Americans or Asian Americans, but demonstrates how there exists this continuum throughout our history of racism and discrimination that we need to reckon with as a nation. Out of the devastation of Executive Order 9066, we also have the story of Redress, where 34 years ago, our government made formal apology for what it had done. And that it had lied about the security threat, that it discriminated against us because of our race and ethnicity. But more importantly, it did pay restitution. We're now over 150 years past the end of the Civil War and the promise of 40 acres and a mule to the Black community and to the descendants of slaves, and they have yet to receive these reparations. Given our community's experience with redress, it's our responsibility to see to it that other communities achieve their redress for wrongs inflicted by our government. The Black community really came out in support of our redress efforts, and it would not have been possible without them. It's now our turn to return that favor and speak out for HR 40 and the legislation that would establish a commission for Black reparations similar to the CWRIC. And the reality is that the CWRC really did reveal some of the depths of what our government had done. And I think for many people, they still don't understand the depths of what slavery really meant for the Black community. And not only that, the ongoing racial discrimination that happens. So as we call for never again, we also must call for reparations now. As we talk about reparations, I think the other thing to mention is one of the lessons from our own redress story is a failure as well. That we failed to include Japanese Latin Americans in our redress. And this is a group which we still need to fight for their redress so that they can also be given the full apology that they are deserving. Before I close, I just wanted to highlight some of the historic education that happens outside of Day of Remembrance, because this isn't something we should only care about once a year. The Japanese American Confinement Sites program administered by the NPS and was mentioned earlier on the panel preceding us. This program supports many projects that carry forth education on the Japanese American incarceration experience. And now I may get in trouble for this because I recognize that we are in a program sponsored by NPS, but that program is nearly out of money and needs to be have more money authorized for that. There is legislation that's been introduced by Congresswoman Matsui in the House and Senator Schatz in the Senate that will authorize additional funding for the JAX program, as well as create a further education program. So we really believe that this is something that is needed, and that we would love to see to be able to pass forward and be able to ensure that there are funds available to continue the education that happens. So I think that there's probably opportunity for so a little bit more discussion about some of these issues that I know Susan, Frank, and Brian have also been very engaged in.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, David, for really bringing us up to the present again. I think what an incredible panel. I learned so much, and it gave me so much to think about. We have some really wonderful questions in the chat, so I will save my own questions and turn to those first. And the first one I want to ask, I think maybe you, Frank, and Susan can begin, and then others please chime in. But Nick asks, what was the overall evolution of feeling between the announcement of a commission-based approach for redress and the CWRIC testimonies, either yours personally or your community, or both? Thank you, Nick, for that question.
Aaron, I'm going to address that real quickly. The Day of Remembrance, on the Day of Remembrance, Congressman Mike Lowry jumped on the back of a pickup truck and said, "I will introduce a bill for direct compensation for Japanese Americans, $25,000 each." And we grabbed him and said, "Good, get up in this pickup truck and say that to this crowd." And he did, and he was committed. He introduced, Mike Lowry, Congressman of Seattle, introduced a bill in 1979 for direct compensation. We immediately ran into opposition from the 4 Japanese Americans in Congress, Matsui, Mineta, Inoue, and Matsunaga, because they weren't ready for it. And so the commission bill was conceived as a direct way to neutralize the Seattle Mavericks. I mean, we were politically naive. I mean, we believed, Henry believed we could get the redress bill introduced, passed in 1 or 2 sessions of Congress. And maybe cooler heads prevailed. Maybe it was a political expediency. Maybe it was a way to neutralize Hayakawa. But the commission bill was conceived and passed, enacted. And then, 2 years later, the commission held their hearings. And history shows that the commission hearings were transformative. I mean, it provided the same emotional catharsis that the first Day of Remembrance, as I described, provided, and provided the foundation, the factual foundation that Congress could rely upon to then pass redress. And from 78 to 88, 10 years is a very short time for the issue to flip and to actually be signed by President Reagan. So it is a remarkable story. But to Nick's question, it wasn't easy, and the Nikkei congressmen fought us at first, but of course then they championed the issue and then passed it through Congress. I recommend this book out of print, Repairing America by William Horry, who, as Brian said, sued the government for redress, and also Born in Seattle by Robert Shimabukuro. So that's the answer.
Then, can I also add that I want to also note Mervyn Dimely, congressman in California, also introduced a direct reparations bill also. And I totally agree with Frank, but just want to, it's hard to overstate that it was at the time quite divisive, this commission hearing versus direct reparations approach. It worked out in the end, but it drove a wedge in the community for a time at that moment.
Yeah, I think that in the NCRR, we were feeling that, people should know by this time that it was wrong. But and we wanted to go straight to legislation also. But I think that it turned out that many people in the community, I think the feeling was that they had never gotten their day in court and they wanted to confront the US government and the public. And I want to pitch a book also. This is the NCRR book. NCRR, The Grassroots Struggle for Japanese American Redress and Reparations. And there's a lot of really good information about the grassroots struggle in Los Angeles mainly, but this was also nationwide. So
I think I'd actually like to kind of bring it to the present when we talk about HR 40. And we kind of all believe that everyone believes slavery was an awful thing and needs to be apologized for. But I remember a couple of years ago when the movie 12 Years a Slave came out, and I was talking to a person at my workplace, and he had just seen the movie, and we were having this conversation, and he says, the imagery of that was just so disturbing of how awful slavery was. And it kind of grabbed me, and I was sort of like thinking, like, what did you think slavery was? I didn't say this to him, but my thought was like, it was slavery. But the problem is we've been culturated that slavery was like gone with the wind. That it's the oh, my slave and I are gonna make a beautiful dress out of our curtains now, and that's what we've been taught that slavery was, but it wasn't. It was an awful thing. Dehumanizing. If you have not been to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, you need to get there and see the exhibits there to really understand the depths. But we have this disconnect where we don't really understand it. And that's why we need this commission to really look at the need for reparations.
I so appreciate how each of you in your talks and then just now, looks to the past and then connects these Day of Remembrances to the present and to what we need to move towards in the future. And I think I've been so inspired. The last session was thinking about healing and this need for storytelling and conversations within communities to hear and sit with our grief and the loss and the joy and the struggle as well. And I think I've been so inspired by Japanese American organizers who are supporting HR 40 and saying, it's our job to support Black Americans. We are here, we can offer some context and some of our own experiences, but we will support, Black Americans as they determine the best path to reparations. And I think we see that in Japanese American history, that we were able to sort of determine what was going to work for us and work through these conflicts. And that's something important to carry forward. I want to turn to another question from the audience, from Shannon, that's directed to Frank, but really I'd love to hear each of you respond to this because I think this is so important and a good way to sort of cap off this first day of programming. So how can today's young people also, and maybe especially those not of Japanese American heritage, help support the remembrance of EO 9066 and Japanese American incarceration and the legacies, I think, of these things as well?
Shannon, two quick answers. Young people can read these books, Years of Infamy by Michi Weglin, Repair in America, and so on. Read these books and share them with your friends and have your libraries carry it. The second thing is talk to your teachers and your school boards as students to defend the teaching of history in the classroom. There is a manufactured culture war occurring in your schools right now, a very cynical attack on what's misleadingly called critical race theory. It's being driven as a wedge issue. It's very cynical. It's an organizing tool for some to, again, attack the teaching of Holocaust history. Mouse, the cartoon book, is being banned in Tennessee. And you simply, the school boards are, I can't imagine what teachers are going through right now, being in the crossfire of these two conflicting tensions. States requiring the teaching of Asian American history while others are banning books. So as young people, talk to your school boards and your administrators to say you want to learn history and you want access to information and you're not going to be hurt by hearing the facts of incarceration or slavery.
One of the things that I think that would be really important too is that especially for people who are not of Japanese American ancestry, there are other aspects of the World War II experience of Japanese Americans that wasn't taking place inside the concentration camps. Some of these things were happening in the halls of Congress and in the executive branch. And so I think it would be really interesting for people to look at, like, why were people so disempowered that they couldn't stand up for Japanese Americans? And there are interesting works coming out. There's a recently published book. I'm sorry, I don't remember the title, but it's a critique of the role of social workers in the incarceration of Japanese Americans. And so I think that, there were many professions and individuals who were complicit in the incarceration of Japanese Americans. And that's a very interesting topic that doesn't require you to be a Japanese American to investigate.
Eric Muller has a book coming out examining the role of lawyers in the WRA centers and the complicity they played, even as some of them were very sympathetic to helping the legal matters of the Nisei incarcerees.
Thank you, Frank. And Tracy helpfully put in the chat the title of the book Susan's referring to is Facilitating Injustice.
Oh, good. Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'd like to add that you don't have to be Japanese American to talk about this. That we don't own rights to tell this history. This is part of American history. This is not just Japanese American history. Even within our own community, I think we're going to see a shift. I personally don't actually have any direct connection to the incarceration experience. My Japanese family immigrated after the war. On the other side of my family, though, I am Chinese American. I have the story of my grandfather being a paper son and then serving in World War II as a Chinese American soldier. So we all come to this from very different perspectives, but it is very much a part of our American history, and it's important that everybody knows this and is able to tell that.
Oh, one thing, though, I think I want to just add that even though I think it's true that the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans is an American story, Japanese Americans have a very deep connection to it. And there are trends now in terms of historical preservation and to acknowledge the connection of descendants to the story. And like, for instance, I think that there was a struggle to include the Black descendants of Thomas Jefferson into the whole curation of the story of Monticello. So very similar to that, I think there are stories that Japanese Americans have a right to have major input on, because we've been the driving force actually over the many decades to preserve this story, to get out all the details of this story, and to tell all the different versions of this story from all the 120,000 people that were incarcerated and descendants. So I think that while this is an American story, it is very definitely something that Japanese Americans are deeply, deeply connected to. And
I think that's a great point, Susan and David, both of you. I think it's the sense of broadening what we inherit as Americans' history, that we all deserve to know our histories, our stories, and where we come from, and to have the opportunity to tell those stories, whether we're Japanese American or from another community. And when you have to work so hard to learn your history, then yes, you need to have the chance to tell it. And that's true really across the board. So thank you all so much. I am so appreciative of these book recommendations. I usually have a wall of books behind me too, but I'm not in my usual location. We are out of time, but to sort of wrap us up, I want to ask each of you a final brief reflection to close out this day, which is really just, what does Day of Remembrance mean to you? It can be one word, one sentence. But Frank, we'll start with you, and we'll go in our speaker order.
It means a lot of work, Erin. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Susan.
But thank you for the White House for reaching out and creating this national program. It is really remarkable to see this engagement. Thank you.
I think to me, the Day of Remembrance means community, and it means multi-generational sharing and commitment.
Thank you. Brian.
I guess just, a moment where the whole community kind of embraces this history, not just of the incarceration, but also the history of redress and the Day of Remembrance itself.
Yeah, I think it's I'll go back to what I said earlier, that it's that aspiration to the never again idea. Mm-hmm. I know we'll never achieve that, but it is something to aspire to.
Thank you so much. That's the perfect ending, really, to this entire day and this panel especially. I want to, as we close, say another huge thank you to our partners, the Japanese American National Museum, JACL National, with your leadership, David, Friends of Minidoka, the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, to Kimiko Mar behind the scenes, running everything so very smoothly, to our sponsors, the Smithsonian Institution, National Park Service, and the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, especially Hanako Wakatsuki, Noriko Sanafuji, Julie Abo, and Dakota Russell put in so much time. Please join us again tomorrow, same place, same times, 1 p.m., 3 p.m., 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And thank you so much again. I'm wishing you all a restful Saturday evening.